I'm very excited to hold virtual space with all of you on what is a particularly heavy day for those of us who are situated in the United States, and what continues to be an ongoing crisis of global pandemic and general heaviness for all of us on the planet. I'm excited today to have this conversation with two artists who can help us to think about the specificity and historical lineages of the crisis of our present. And I'm excited to hear more about their artistic process, the research behind the respective works that are in the shows, are in the show. And so I'll start with brief introductions, and then I will turn it over to Beatrice and then to Deborah to tell us more about their respective works. So Beatrice Glow is an interdisciplinary and multisensory artist working in the service of public history and just futures. Through diasporic and decolonial lens, she interrogates the visual languages of luxury and power derived through the exploitation of botanical life. Her solo exhibitions include Once the Smoke Clears at Baltimore Museum of Art. This is happening right now. I believe it's still on view. Opened very recently. Forts and Flowers at Taipei Contemporary Art Center in Taiwan in 2019, and Aromérica Parfumeur at Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes de Chile in 2016. It's been a while since I've practiced my Spanish. Her work has been supported by Yale National University of Singapore College, Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU, and the Fulbright Scholars Program. Beatrice has two pieces that are in the Thousand Secrets exhibition. One is an olfactory installation called Spice is Gold, and the other is a single channel video called Obanda. And Deborah Jack is a St. Martin and Jersey City-based multidisciplinary artist whose work in video and sound installation, photography, painting, and text. Her work engages a variety of strategies for mining the intersections of histories, cultural memory, ecology, and climate change while negotiating a global present. She is exhibited at Perez Art Museum of Miami, the Museum of Latin American Art in Los Angeles, SITE in Santa Fe, and the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and has had her works reviewed in Hyperallergic, Freeze, Artsy, and the New York Times. In fall 2021, Deborah Jack, 20 Years, was presented at Pen and Brush in New York City. And Deborah's piece in A Thousand Secrets is called Drawn by Water, Sea Drawing in 3 Acts, and this is the third installation with subtitle Sinking. I remember that the embrace of oceans is the love I know, and yearn for a familiar shore that. And this is a piece from 2018. I'm so excited to hear more about your processes, and I will now turn it over to Beatrice. Thank you.
One second, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Well, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So hello, my name is Beatrice Glow. Thank you Apexart for hosting our event, Mae for bringing the artists together in the show, and Deborah for our connection. The song we heard at the very beginning of the event was recently recorded in the Banda Islands, and it is a welcome song for Kampong Salaman. So I'll be bringing more context of why we chose this song shortly. So I was born in Turtle Island, North America, in Ohlone Territory, California, but my roots are tied to the migrations along the Maritime Silk Road, as well as the mountains and coasts of Australasia in Southeast and Western Taiwan. So for those of us who are first hearing the word Australasia, it is an expansive region spanning from Taiwan to Madagascar to Hawaii, Aotearoa to Rapa Nui. These islands share a linguistic heritage that trace back to the diverse indigenous groups in Taiwan. So growing up in California, I often felt like a diasporic algae floating in the ocean between Asia, the the Great Ocean, and the Americas, where my belongings often questioned. And when I think of my late uncle, I remember how he once pointed westward across the Pacific and told me that Taiwan was just on the other side. This relational way of thinking about kinship throughout the global archipelago through oceanic, diasporic, and human circulations underpins my own approach to looking for ways to reshape public narratives for more regenerative dialogues and futures. So one guiding mantra for me is always to think that all islands are interconnected underwater and guides my worldview. So one main thread in my work since 2013 has been the social histories of plants and how they sketch vignettes about the entangled realities of dispossession, enslavement, migrations, and extractive economies. I look to scholar Daniela Bleichmar's Visible Empires work, where she draws the parallels of the imperial vision machine of botanical illustrations that were produced during expeditions of the early modern period, and how the colonial gaze of categorizing humans and thereby forcing colonial subjects into a racial hierarchy that parallels natural history illustrations as well as museographic displays that dissected plants as well as non-human animals of our living world apart with the clinical gaze, divorcing the flora and fauna from their original cultural context, splaying apart their organs and suspending them in what Dr. Bleichmer calls a global white space that's ripe for exploiting botanical life and human labor in a plantation economy. This thinking influenced my own thinking about the social history of plants as a non-anthropocentric approach to bring forth intertwined histories of othering and extraction. So in reading about the spice roots and the traveling along my own journey to situate myself between Asia, the Great Ocean, and the Americas, I searched within the botanical expeditions and I learned more about our own human alienation from our vibrant living world. And it led me to my ongoing multi-year project called Manhattan, A Tale of Two Islands, that is the basis for the video and sculptural installation on view at Apex right now. So the story that really inspired me was I learned a watershed moment in history where in the year 1667, the road map was redrawn when the Dutch East India Company traded the island of Manhattan for the English colony of Rune in Indonesia's Banda Islands in an attempt to monopolize the nutmeg trade. And Suriname was also swapped in the process for its sugar plantations. Nutmegs once only grew in the Banda Islands, even though we find them to be commonplace spices today in our kitchen cabinets. And the Banda Islands are located in the Maluku region of eastern Indonesia near Papua New Guinea. The Banda Islands remain very hard to reach today, but for centuries, Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, and Indian traders traveled to and sometimes settled in Banda and the region before the arrival of the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English. And even centuries before Raffles brought nutmeg mania to found what we know as Singapore today. So it's a really, really important group of islands that is really overlooked today, yet has really important historical importance in global trade history. So shown here is the island of Rune. It's the most far-flung of the Banda Island archipelago, and it was England's first colony. The Spice Islands were so important that at the turn of the 16th century, the Portuguese and the Spanish tried to divide the world in half with the Treaty of Tordesillas and the Treaty of Saragossa, and they drew and redrew the meridian line revolved around the Maluku region. So this momentous land exchange of New York for Rune over spices precipitated change that set in motion unstoppable waves of displacements, migrations, and laid the ground for economic systems that shape our lives till today. So I also learned that the Austronesians also settled in the Banda Islands. So living in New York, I became very obsessed looking at the shared histories of two islands that would tie New York to Austronesia and form connections across the global archipelago that could hold potential for centering on more relational thinking. It also gave me a floating algae, some more currents to flow with. I first created a digital print on silk featuring nutmeg and cloves while taking compositional cues from mantones in Manila, Spanish silk shawls that originated from China that were then ferried along with spices on the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade maritime routes that first connected Asia, Americas, and Europe for the first time in the 16th century. I also made a sculptural and olfactory installation titled Manhattan Tea Room. It's currently on view at Lyndhurst Mansion, a little plug, wherein Bloody Delphoi references history. This was first installed at Wave Hill Public Garden Culture Center in the Bronx, and it later on traveled onward to Hawaii and to activate trade in oceanic flows. The installation space was imbued with scents from the spice trade, peppery, nutmegs, cloves, and cinnamon notes. It smelled like commerce. So I started to source and layer on archival images depicting the atrocities of the spice trade onto the dishware. Materials and objects carry history, so I want to know if the objects could speak for themselves. What would they say? What would they have witnessed? Would they recall how the volcano, shown here, Gunung Api, of the Banda Islands erupted when the Dutch ships first sailed into the Bandanese ports for the first time, as though to signal a seismic shift in the cultural landscape of the region and the world? Would it tell us about how 401 years ago, in 1621, the Dutch East India Company, aided by the Japanese mercenaries, murdered 15,000 Bandanese people, which was 90% of the population? That's right. The world's first genocide led by a multinational company, the Dutch East India Company, took place in 1621 in Fort Nassau in the Banda Islands of Indonesia, shown here, in pursuit of cornering the nutmeg trade. This set the precedent of genocidal policies that the Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, carried out in the Western Hemisphere. Banda is in many ways seen as a testing ground for what was to come. Researching this very difficult and dark history that took place in Fort Nassau, the Banda Islands, shown here on the left, led to the realization that it's the same shape as Fort Amsterdam of Lower Manhattan in this map from 1676, another massacre site of the Lenape, the original peoples of the estuary region that New York is part of. So I wondered how it is that two islands that were exchanged for each other, one by the Dutch East India Company and the other by the Dutch West India Company, were both dominated and marked by these star-shaped forts. What is this cookie cutter pattern of violence? So ironically, while I was sitting in New York trying to figure this out, it was easier to find some documentation on Bandanese history, but less on the Lenape people. This is back in 2014, 15, the original peoples in New York. And it really started to reveal uneven gaps in the archives for myself. So I just want to give a little more context. Today, on top of the foundations of Fort Amsterdam, which is not far from Apex when I think about it, sits the US Customs House, right? So this is the same building that repurposed and brought over, and it now houses the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian, the George Gustav Hayes Center in Lower Manhattan. And on the walls, paintings of former Dutch colonies still hang in this room. This is where about over 70% of American wealth passed through the ports in the early part of the 20th century. So this is the Customs House Rotunda, where the frescoes still celebrate European explorers like Vespucci, Magellan, Cabo, Hudson, and Columbus. And it's similar to the Jan Pieter Koen, who was still celebrated in Jakarta's History Museum, as well as throughout the Netherlands, despite being the executioner of the Bandanese people. Memory is quite short when I think about these monuments of history. So these star-shaped forts are often markers of colonial trauma. They can be spotted from Ghana to Indonesia, New York to Taiwan. Here is Fort Zeelandia in Taiwan. One night during my stay in Banda, Gunung Api, the volcano, shook me out of slumber. I was afraid to sleep, obviously, so I stayed up researching more about Banda, and I learned that Fort Zeelandia in Taiwan was built by enslaved Bandanese people who survived the massacre. The earth spoke. So the invention of the gunpowder created a forceful smoke that led to a new fort architecture from the 16th to 19th centuries and populated the world where Dutch, Portuguese, English traders prevailed. Renaissance period military engineer Vitruvius and writings on utopia inspired this Venetian fortified city, Palma Nova. Gunpowder smoke heralded in these early forms of panopticons, bastion forts that doubled as trading posts and spice warehouses. This is Fort Belgica in the Banda Islands of present-day Indonesia. Not far from the Fort Nassau I just showed, this is Fort J on Governor's Island in New York, which was formerly called Nut Island for its chestnuts, not nutmegs. This is Fort McHenry in Baltimore, the Star Fort reference in the American national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. And I suspect the Pentagon also took architectural cues and from the Star Forts. And this is the shopping mall in Shanghai. It's all the extractive economies embodied in one space. So while I was using a drone to film star forts in Banda, I saw that the forms echoed each other. The drone can be weaponized and its camera transforms into a roaming panopticon. The 21st century aerial military technology dominates land in the same spirit as early modern period military technology star forts. The star, a celestial divine symbol, became a death bomb in the sky. Coming back to layering the shared histories of Manhattan and Banda, I wondered if I could create a project that can fold within all these histories of dispossession, violence, enslavement, and forced migrations, and distorted relationships to resource and land. While Manhattan was a backwater trading post, Rouen was a Covida spice island 7 times smaller, yet today one is a financial capital, while another has become obscure. To find out more about the historic relationship between New York and Banda, in 2017, I traveled to Banda via many legs of journeys and a slow boat that took many hours until I finally arrived. I wanted to meet the cultural knowledge bearers and see if they cared to connect with New York and the Lenape people. The highlight of the trip was the journey on this catamaran from Banda Neira, the main island of the archipelago, to get to Rouen, the island that Manhattan was exchanged for, along with Suriname, on the Treaty of Breda. The waters in the open Banda Sea were very rocky, and even the locals on board started to cry as a storm drew near us and overshadowed us. But we survived, and we made it to Rouen, so shown here is the site of arriving. And we were welcome to stay at the home of Pak Abdullah, the father of Sabto Labe, the school director in Rouen and the local leader. Here's a quick little welcome from him.
Hello, welcome to Manhattan Island. Rouen. It's nice place, beautiful island, smile of the people, yeah, beautiful coral in the sea, and many fish.
So you see, Sabto takes a lot of pride about his relationship with New York, that he called his own house Manhattan, #1 and #2 for his father's home. So I got to share with a lot of young people in Rouen this image by ecologist Dr. Eric Sanderson for the Manhattan Project that digitally reconstructs New York in 1609 prior to Dutch colonization and the juxtaposition of the current New York skyline. And I told them it was a biologically diverse place prior to colonization with over 55 rich ecosystems because of the stewardship of the original peoples. And I shared that many Lenape settlements in Manhattan, I showed this map of them to show them that there are other stories that are not told through media because most of them receive information through Hollywood at this point about New York City. I also told them about how my collaborators and I were trying to disrupt settler colonial narratives by revealing indigenous geographies and invoking the name of regional cultures of New York. The Bandanese were very surprised by the lesser known histories of New York, and they joked, let's swap our islands again. So I also met Rudy Fulfide, whose poem, O Banda, is featured in the video currently on view at Apexart. And he told me that artists from Banda and New York need to keep exchanging and visiting with each other to make new stories for each other. So I was really inspired by Rudy Fulfide and the many culture bearers I got to meet on both islands. So I often think about how the shared heritage of Manhattan and Banda can also tell us more about the shared environmental futures of these two islands and what they implicate for our living world. And speaking with one of my teachers, Chief Reggie Dancer Seas of the Matinacock Nation of present-day Queens on Long Island, he had a message for Banda. He wanted to share a sacred tobacco gift, Kinnick, for the Bandanese. So my friend delivered it to a group of elders and 7 chamat, and they returned nutmegs as a response to starting this exchange of sacred plants from each island and to build a new type of relationship. So telling these stories about the connection between Rouen and Manhattan is not only about remembering colonial treaties that first connected communities, but it's also about honoring our shared histories between extreme ends of the world to transcend pain and build platforms for sharing joy and resilience. It's also about telling our stories and strengthening the foundations of our fabric, our cultural fabric, that will carry us through our collective survival in face of the challenges ahead. So with that, I just wanted to share a song from my friend, dear friend Brent Stonefish and his son Xander Stonefish. This is a song of giving thanks. They're Lenape culture bearers who reside in Moravian Town in Ontario, Canada, Turtle Island. And the song is by the brother Bruce Stonefish, who recently passed on.
So we thought we'd better acknowledge him for creating this song for us to share. Okay.
thank you very much for allowing me to share some background history. I now would like to return the floor to Apexart and also invite Deborah to also share her process. Thank you.
Hello, hi, I guess I'm just gonna launch right in. So hi, thank you for Apexart and to Mae for including me in this amazing exhibition. It's powerful to listen to Beatrice's presentation. I've known her work for a while, but it was the first time for me to be able to really sort of hear her talk about it. And so very inspiring work. So I'm just gonna share a little bit about the background of the work I make and look at some of the videos that make up the Drawn by Water project, I guess, so to speak. So I'll say since the early 2000s, my work has been a direct reference to Atlantic hurricanes that I see that serve as a manifestation of the Black Atlantic or the Middle Passage. My work in that sort of comes from a different kind of thinking about the archive. St. Martin is a 37 square mile island that's located in the Eastern Caribbean. It's close to Puerto Rico, sort of like almost like in the middle of the archipelago, so to speak. And so St. Martin historically was colonized by the Spanish, the English, the Danish, the French, and inevitably the Dutch. St. Martin is also an island that's divided and ruled by France and the Netherlands. It's 37 square miles. It's ruled by 2 countries. I believe it's a Jeopardy question. It's the smallest landmass run by 2 countries. And so just in terms to give some context, it was part of the Netherlands Antilles, which was the Dutch colonies here in the Atlantic region. And so St. Martin was part of what they call the Windward Islands, which is Saba, St. Eustatius, and St. Martin. The 3 S's, and then 900 kilometers to the south, you have Curacao, Aruba, and Bonaire, which were the ABC Islands, known as that. Curacao served as sort of like the capital and sort of the administrative capital and political capital of the 6 islands up until essentially 2010, when we had a referendum that split that association. So each island became a sort of country. St. Martin became a country within the Netherlands. That's the language that they use. Country St. Martin, country Curacao, country Aruba. And then the 3 smallest islands, Saba, St. Eustatius, and Bonaire, decided to become a province under the Netherlands. So they are directly now considered almost just, a province of the Netherlands, whereas we have a certain amount of autonomy, Aruba, St. Martin, and Curacao. Part of that autonomy comes from a tourism industry for St. Martin, and being able to sort of contribute to the sort of general domestic income to those islands. And so also a really important fact is that the St. Martin, because of its location within the Caribbean, the primary language is English, the mother tongue. Everyone speaks English. Our official language, though, is Dutch. The educational system is run in Dutch. That also ended, but when I went to high school, elementary school, for instance, we learned geography in Dutch. Our history books were written in Dutch, everything, even our English book. Our book teaching us English grammar was a Dutch book teaching us English grammar. So just to understand that connection, where in Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire, they have their own language that they developed called Papiamento, which is a Creole that comes from African, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch languages, a sort of mixture of that. And so that's their mother tongue, but Dutch is also their official language. But I think also because of the importance administratively of those larger islands, Dutch also is very widely spoken, whereas in St. Martin, not so much. St. Martin, Saba, and St. Eustatius, you spoke it in school and then you went home and you spoke English. But what that has created is a system and a society where all our laws are written in Dutch. our statutes, our legislation is all recorded in Dutch, right? And so a lot of times, for instance, if someone goes to court and a court case is happening, your lawyers talk in Dutch, the judge will speak in Dutch, everything for the most part is happening, and you sort of have to depend on your lawyer to kind of like translate for you, but a lot of things get lost in translation. So if you can imagine sort of the structure, even though it seems pretty liberal, is there's a level of control in very important sort of aspects. Even if things are discussed in government in English, the final documentation has to be written in Dutch. And so, yeah. So my work is thinking about the history of the Middle Passage. It sort of came about because of an absence of information. So if you can imagine, I gave a little bit of that background because thinking about the educational system then, if your history book is a Dutch book, history will always be sort of like in the favor of the Dutch. I was really lucky to have a high school teacher, Miss Maria van Enkelvoort, who was a bit of a rebel. And she was like, look, in the Dutch history book, the Dutch will always be the winner. In American history book, they'll always be the winner. And so she actually had accessed a lot of like Caribbean history that wasn't our official textbook, and photocopied that and gave that to us and had us read like sort of like 3 versions of the same story and had us have this conversation, which no one had ever really done before. And so those of us took away from that, you know, like history, it depends on who writes it. So I learned at a very early age then just how those narratives are constructed narratives. And I think it's something that I ended up taking with me. But that being said, that search for information, that search for history was always sort of controlled somewhere else. I hadn't seen archival photos of St. Martin until I was in my 20s, when there was an exhibition at the library where someone had accessed images from the Dutch archive and printed them and brought them. And I remember everybody coming to the library kind of like, you know, sort of seeing old images of the town and seeing maybe family members and how it was. And I remember just asking the librarian, like, where did these come from, you know? And she explained that, you know, they had gotten them from the Dutch archive. And these were copies. And I remember asking, can you buy these? Like, and it was like, no, you can't buy these. This is now, you know, the only copies are what we access and we have control of them. And part of that arrangement is that you couldn't copy them and sell them. So pardon me, I live near an airport. So if you hear something, it's a plane. So that sort of began also my frustration with being able to access that kind of information about ourselves and that it was located somewhere else. You weren't really encouraged to sort of like question that, you know, you sort of, life goes on. But in wanting to sort of always know more, I started thinking about archive and how our archive, our images, the information about us was housed all the way in the Netherlands, you know, thousands of miles away, and in a way that you couldn't even access it as an ordinary person, that these museums about you existed somewhere else outside of a daily view. And so that idea of archive for me then influenced my work in the sense that I wanted to create images then for an archive that didn't exist, which led me then to sort of thinking about memory and our relationship to nature. You know, we lived in a space that is tourism based, and so without most of our flora and fauna is presented in a way that's for sale. It's about consumption in a tourism market. So your history was always sort of whitewashed so that it looked, you know, enticing to tourists. Like, nobody wants to think that, you know, the plantation that the gift shop is in is also a site of crimes against humanity, right? That's not going to sell cruise ships. And so you were always sort of taught, I think you're brought up with this idea of like tourism being your sole source of income as a way to like always sort of whitewash or, you know, talk down a bit, you know, don't highlight that aspect of your history, even though you live it and historically in your family, it's part of historical memory. But that sort of suppression and amnesia is what sort of led me thinking about salt. Salt was one of the reasons that the Dutch colonized St. Martin. It had a large salt producing pond. The island of Bonaire also had one. And so being able to have salt, even though we didn't have much else sort of in terms of agriculture or for them to trade, because St. Kitts had a really powerful sort of like sugar plantation culture, but for us it was salt. And so mining that salt also then gave the Dutch this sort of advantage. You know, there's some images you can see of like massive mounds of salt being shipped to the Netherlands, which then allowed them to go to sail all over the world and do and continue this sort of extractive, like capitalist behavior, right? And so there was power in that salt, but not that we knew of, right? We thought of it as something for sustenance. And so a lot of those disconnects and layers. My work looks at hurricanes because the rain in a hurricane is salt water. I think about how salt corrodes and it preserves. So I connect that to memory, how we remember some things and how we forget. Some memories are corroded and some are preserved, and what inevitably decides that for us. So the Drawn by Water series really came out of an experience in 2017 with the hurricanes Maria and Irma. And the aftermath. You know, a lot of times we think of these storms and, you know, sort of the damage that nature unleashes. And, you know, I was thinking about the storm that way too. But then I also was thinking about the aftermath of hurricanes in terms of like how power is then assumed or reestablished by colonial powers or, you know, economic powers. But in our sense, it was colonial, where the Netherlands, while because of our political structure as a country, so for instance, a Dutch person couldn't come to St. Martin and just start working. They would have to apply for a work permit still, right? Whereas in the islands that are provinces, they could just sort of walk in and live and act that way. So that bit of control was still ours. After the hurricane, you know, there was all of a sudden our borders were being questioned. Our border with the French side is one that it has a sign that says, welcome to the French side, welcome to the Dutch side, that's it. It's not a controlled border. All of a sudden, we had soldiers controlling the border. The fluidity of that border leads to the fact that so many families are mingled, right? This notion of Dutch and French is really a construct and a political and official sort of construct. So you had people who were suddenly not able to get to their mother, or their kids couldn't go to school because the school, they live on the French side, but the school's on the Dutch side and vice versa. But having to check, and people were not accustomed to that. You know, all of a sudden in the need for disaster relief, all of a sudden France established France, and the Dutch were like, this is the Dutch. And so all of a sudden this border became a way to control aid or to make sure things weren't shared that didn't need to be shared. And so this work had to do with the fact too that the Dutch government wanted to take back a certain amount of control from the elected officials of the island. And so I was struck by the fact that a disaster emergency aid was being withheld. You know, like the suggestion was being like, well, you know, we can't give you this unless you sign over the fact that we don't think you'll distribute this well and sufficiently. So you have to give us control of the government to do this. And it blew my mind. And so I started this piece that I had already been working on. I was thinking about borders to a certain extent. So the water here that you'll see this is the coast of the Netherlands. And then all of the water that you see in these rectangles is water from St. Martin. And I'll play it a little bit of it. I'm going to keep an eye on the time, but the sound that you're hearing is the Rossby Whistle. And the Rossby Whistle is something I introduced into my work, thinking about the connectivity of the Caribbean as a region. It's a sound that's produced from the Caribbean Sea Basin as water moves westward across the seafloor and back in 120 cycles. And creates this tone that's not audible to the human ear, but can be heard, picked up by satellites. I was intrigued by this sound as something that could represent the sort of like unity of the space, of the Caribbean as a region, thinking of like what Beatrice was saying, that all islands are connected underwater, and that here was this underwater space creating a sound. And so I wanted to bring that into the piece, thinking about the region that had been impacted in 2017. Puerto Rico had been devastated, Cuba, different islands had all been devastated by these increasingly powerful storms that were also being fueled by climate change that could be tied then to sort of extractive, capitalist sort of behavior that was impacting the planet. And here we are, on sort of like this forefront, this strip of islands that's sort of on the edge of this sort of precarity in this precarious space. So it was called Sea Drawings also too, because I was thinking about sort of the resonance of the pattern that the water made on the coastline, and that it was temporary, and that it was sort of nature's own way of creating drawings that resisted then, that was different to the way like man-made sort of lines were being constructed as well. Which then got me thinking too about mapping. I had been looking at old Dutch maps from the New York Public Library, and just always sort of just collecting them on random days, sort of going in, because I knew about the connection between New York and Manhattan and the history of the Dutch there. Just as being a kid visiting my aunt and going to places and hearing Dutch names. And it was like, why is this Dutch? Why does this have a Dutch name? Why do they celebrate Pinkster at Phillips Manor in Tarrytown? Like what, when we have Pinksteren as a religious festival, and then learning about the Dutch presence in the Hudson area specifically. So there are a lot of like, I think my mind is one where there's all these sort of like layers of information that are always sort of like in the work. Also thinking about, Dutch art history and that sort of idea of the sort of the grid, and also how grids are used in mapping as a way to control these sort of organic spaces that resist gridding as well. And so these layers were also being built into the work. Also thinking about this notion of weight on the water, and this coastline as a site of sea level rising, that the Dutch as a country have an existential issue with the rise of sea level, right? They are, for a majority of the country, sits already below the sea level, and it's controlled by dikes and dams in the country. So I wanted then the conversation for us to think about shared vulnerabilities, right? Both our coastlines are being impacted by climate change, but the Dutch never have this conversation about their precarity as being tied to ineffective governance, right? Their issues with climate control, with the climate, and have to do with something else. But whenever you talk about hurricanes and disasters in our region and things not going well, suddenly the discussion becomes about misappropriation of funds or corrupt governments. And so a lot of that conversation fueled the work. And so Act 2 was then an installation at the Perez Museum, which was called Saltwater Requiem. And then The Wind Whispered Sometimes, the Aftermath is the Storm. And in that, I was still thinking about this idea of aftermath, right? That we think that the thing that creates the most damage, the moment that the most damage occurs is during the storm. And I was thinking afterwards in terms of, well, sometimes the aftermath is the storm. And that was a note that I had written to myself, like while looking at all this sort of like political upheaval that was going on, and the negotiations and this sort of struggle to get help. And I said, wow, the aftermath is way more damaging, seizing of political and national control from elected officials of the people. It felt like the aftermath was something that we really needed to examine as well. And so this piece, so the Rossby Whistle is in this piece as well. I like to think of it as kind of like almost like a heartbeat, and the frequency runs throughout. But the song that you're hearing over it is a Methodist hymn called Let Your Lower Lights Be Burning. that's like slowed down to like almost an unrecognizable point, and that's played over the space. And you see the sort of shifting panels of water that again was my sort of response to this shifting notion of what borders meant, and what borders represented to the Dutch government and the French government, as opposed to the people who lived in the space, that we didn't recognize them or that they were fluid. And that borders was something that you had to sort of negotiate only when thinking about like your sort of like your colonial master, for lack of a better word. And so this piece, again, was using the eye of the hurricane as a sort of beginning point. So I start with the end and I show a little bit of the beginning in the video. And so you hear sort of like that sound as well in the piece. It's much longer, it's a 6-minute loop that people could sit through. My more recent work is still looking at satellite imagery. Again, this sort of like as almost an ultimate form of surveillance, I guess, right? This sort of eye in the sky that sort of, I tell people every now and again, I go on Google Earth and I zoom in on my mom's house, just because I think it's crazy that I can zoom in on my mom's house and see the car in the garage, right? So that level of surveillance, that idea that you can sort of see from above, but also that, for me, I've always thought of, especially coming from St. Martin, the idea of small islands, I think is different than say like a larger island like Cuba, Dominican Republic, Jamaica. I think islands that are large, or Australia. I think people who live on small islands have a different relationship to the sea. The ocean is something that's ever present. It's all around you. On St. Martin, you can stand at almost any point and see the coastline. And so I think that creates a different sort of relationship too for people as they live in these spaces, as how they think about the sea and how they think about the land as it exists in those spaces, whether it's at the forefront or not. And so this piece was then also thinking about the Rossby Whistle. So the blue that you see here is actually then the sound waves from the Rossby Whistle that I captured and then printed out and started thinking of it as a drawing, as a way to sort of visualize something that was inaudible and also just not a visual thing, sound, you can't always hear it, and making it visible using, there's salt here and there's gold leaf. This is a flower that's a flamboyant flower that blooms in July primarily. This year, actually, we're having a strange year where it bloomed in June. So everyone's kind of like curious about that. Like every now and again, people are posting on Facebook, like, I guess we need to call it the June tree because culturally on our island, we call it the July tree because it always blooms in July, almost like clockwork. And so it's been very strange to be here from the beginning of June and see the flowers blooming already. So, you know, for some people already are talking like it's an omen, you know, like what does this mean for hurricane season? And so for me, thinking about this flower as a sort of very sort of in terms of nature, a small sort of like aspect of nature as opposed to something large as the hurricane, and how what could be seen as a fragment can also be something as a point of discussion for the whole or something that was much larger. And so this is the song The Tempest Sings, Traveled on the Currents to be heard. And so that's that piece. And then I also have been taking photos of the surface of the sea and around St. Martin. And then, you know, adhering gold leaf and salt onto the surface of these prints. Again, thinking about sort of something as small and as specific as the surface of the water, but also that it can look like atmospheric maps that you have of satellites. If you look at satellite images, there's water vapor images, and water vapor images tend to look like this sort of black and white, like almost like the surface of water. And so I wanted to think about that again, that how something that was so specific as the surface of the sea could also speak to something that was larger and almost something that was, you know, thinking of almost this idea of inner space and thinking about outer space and the tension between those two things. That's just another in the image of that series. And I was going to stop here, and then if you had questions and in the conversation, we could always sort of go more into it.
Thank you both so much for some really incredible and rich presentations. I have some questions prepared and that have come up as you've both been speaking, but I want to give you first a chance to respond to each other and ask any questions if there was anything that came up. And if not, I can start if you don't have one, a question ready at hand.
I just want to thank Deborah. Those last images were so striking, and I wish I could see them in person. I'm wondering how big those are, those prints.
They're about, was it like 20 by 31 inches? Yeah.
Cool.
But I'm also thinking of being larger.
I also had many notes. I was starting to take notes as I listened to you. I feel like we have so many crossovers. I'm a little goosebumpy and my blood is flowing with all the stories, especially you talking about suppression and amnesia as sort of what propelled a lot of your curiosity to make work. And also you talking about how someone else holds your archives and what does that feel like? When I was around 11 years old, I started to ask my father many questions like, well, what is the history, the prehistory of the region, and where can we find more about ancestors? And he was like, well, one day when you're older and you can travel, you'll go to the Netherlands, to the Maritime Museum, and you'll find out. You know, so it's been kind of a full circle now. I am starting projects with the archives there, and it's very fascinating and chilling and exciting to also embark on a journey of not only thinking about your own history, but the shared history. So I think what we're doing today, it's an artist and conversation event, but it's also evoking many of the ways in which we intersect. So I'm just grateful for this moment. Thank you.
No, I had a similar response to thinking about the forts, and I was like, wait, what is the shape of Fort Amsterdam in our capital, Philipsburg? Because there's a Fort Amsterdam there too, and I've never, you know, that's the great, you know, one of the interesting things about drone photography, right? Because all of a sudden you get this aerial view, and if you you know, so you can see. So I'm now curious to see if it's another star, and then maybe I could send it to you, because I think, you know, what's interesting is that the history of Indonesia was something that wasn't something that was necessarily taught, but because of the connection with the Dutch, like one of the first restaurants that we had that was like on the island was an Indonesian restaurant. Like we all knew what rijsttafel was, with like, you know, like and it was a special place to go to, just because of, like, you know, St. Martin at that point had people from Suriname who lived there, and from all the other islands and countries. And so you know, I actually visited Indonesia, but we didn't really, it was for a literary festival. But I remember being there and thinking also too, just about, I guess, I will say it comes together in Suriname. Suriname might be an interesting point of intersection between both our worlds, right? Because Suriname had this large group of people from what they call Javanese, was what the Dutch referred to them, right? As well as East Indian and Chinese, and who came over as sort of indentured workers right after slavery. But, you know, I remember going to a Caribbean festival called Cara Festa, and everybody would, you know, the line for the Surinamese booth was like amazingly long for the food, because the food it's like touches on so many different cultures, right? But when we had the national nights where people had to sort of share like a national dance and stuff, you know, Suriname had like a full-on, like, you know, West African dance, Javanese dance, you know, like Balinese style dancing, and Indian dance. And they all came, and I sat there going like, wait, like how many countries, right? But until you sort of leave, it's weird, until you leave the space or the island and look back and see where this other information is, you go like, wait, none of that is seen, you know, in your home, right? In your home space. I'm also too, like, you know, was looking at just when I was thinking of working with the Royal Institute of the Tropics, because I always think of it as Koninklijke Instituut van de Troop. So I have to translate it in my head. I'm like, what does that mean? Royal Institute. But that's where all the, you know, when I looked at that, I was like, wait, Indonesia's in here too. And like all these islands that were, you know, like they have everybody's information in the Netherlands. And I thought that was, you know, that was mind blowing to me. So I actually have a new piece that's looking, that's using images from a early 1940s documentary on St. Martin, Saba, and Statia that they made for people back in the Netherlands. And it's got all this footage that, you know, we'd never seen. And the reason I found that video, that I knew it even existed, was because I was Googling something about images of Old St. Martin, and a real estate agent had posted it on her social media, a clip from this black and white documentary, because she was thinking about trying to sell how bucolic and beautiful St. Martin was and still is. And I was, you know, and I'm looking at this going like, wait, how do you, a real estate agent, have access to this? And I don't even know this exists, you know? So I went hunting for it. So it's, yeah, there's a lot of overlapping connections, but I think the Dutch have been really great about making it seem very benevolent. You know, I've always marveled at the fact that most people, when they think of slavery and colonialism, the Dutch is not the first, but they were like so instrumental in constructing so many of the structures to make this so efficient and deadly. But they've escaped a lot of the condemnation historically that other countries, I think, have gotten. So it's you know, it's always refreshing to see work like Beatrice's.
I do think we're in a very exciting moment. At the same time, there's a lot of reckoning that's being done in the Netherlands. I'm sure you're aware because of our mutual friend who was a Dutch scholar who introduced this. Yeah, but actually I am starting to work with a Surinamese filmmaker and a Dutch Surinamese filmmaker, and it's been very fascinating learning together. I know this is maybe a little off topic, but at the same time, there is the Dutch National Archives, they just released their recently digitized, they call it the Atlantic Archives, but it's really focused on their documents of enslavement. So I think they are really actively looking for artists to engage.
Yes.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, I saw that call had come out, and I was like, "Ooh, okay." Like, really. What's interesting though about that is that while they're doing that in the Netherlands, the political behavior that is happening in terms of like conversations around political autonomy and in economic autonomy that's happening in the island itself. Whenever you bring up, you know, ideas of reparations, it gets shut down very quickly. Like, you know, so I, on one hand, I'm out here listening to these conversations about a reckoning with slavery and that they're doing this. And then I go like, but when you bring up slavery, like in the site that it happened, like all of a sudden it's like you're overreacting, it gets shut down. That's not part of the discussion now. It's curious for me.
Mm-hmm. I think those would be some points you raised. Yes. Mae, I feel like you told us to just connect a little and we're kind of running away. So I just wanted to check in.
No, you know, it's like every sort of comment raises new questions for me. And I'm thinking, so I've done some archival research in the British Maritime Museum for my dissertation research. And, you know, it's a similar contradiction of this idea of like, you don't have to go to any of the former British colonies because all of the papers are held in Liverpool or in London. But at the same time, you know, especially being at the Maritime Museum, like there's so much that they don't keep there. Like I couldn't find any traces of resistance or revolt from the 19th or 20th century. They aren't documents of labor strikes or any type of dissent. It's very much this curated, like even like listening for the kind of silences and traces. It's very hard to find the full story. And then, you know, for me, the couple of times that I was doing that research, it was, you know, I was the only person in the room that was below 65 years old. It was like me and 25 old white dudes who were in the sort of like boys and toys, like enthusiast of like the classic oh, like this ship and this model, and we just came back from holiday in Sri Lanka. And so, I'm thinking about, this question of absence, of presence, of thinking about the ways that you see each of your art, not just responding to these silences and the question of where the archives are located, but really countering these narratives, giving voice to the stories that are not in the conventional archive per se, whether that's through engaging with indigenous epistemologies, thinking more expansively about these kinds of maps that transcend the conventional cartographic grid. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is, as much as there's a very striking visual element to each of your work, there's also this way of thinking about sound and smell as a way of connecting regions, and like thinking about those senses as, sometimes coming secondary to the visual. And I'm interested in if you could say more about those choice of multisensory and media in your work, and how that kind of allows you to confront the restrictions, challenges of the archive in that narrow sense that we often are exposed to.
Deborah, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, I guess in my case, I'm using sound as well, but I'm also thinking, I mean, even in terms of the construction of some of these sort of narratives and stories that I put together, like even in other projects, it is coming from that sort of rejection of like the written archive, right? And what's stored away as opposed to what lives in people's memories and in their stories. And so, I'm always thinking of my work as sort of, resisting archive. I don't necessarily go and look into the books to see what's been written about the island or me. I just go ask somebody, right? I talk to elders or I talk to their kids who know then the stories that have been passed down, and I'm really more interested in that approach. And it's always interesting to me because a lot of times there'll be an intersection in what's in the book, in written somewhere or in an archive, right? But having heard almost like the oral history version first, it affects then how you look then at that information that's stored in the archive in a way that for me then is way more productive. So, that idea of the invisible sound is one that it's the invisible sound of our oral traditions as well. A lot of those stories have been silenced, right? We've lost encyclopedias in terms of people who've passed on. And so when I'm, in one of my pieces, I have a woman singing a song that she, Clara Reyes, who's doing this sort of her own anthropological, like cultural research. And she's coming to it from dance on St. Martin, and how a lot of these dances were accompanied by songs that the community sang. Right. And so now she's been like interviewing, a lot of elders and trying to piece together songs that they remember from their childhood, because that's when it's from, and so she found this one song and I, recorded it and we put it on one of the videos. And so in a way that's me then, okay, now we have audio of this particular song that's now been sort of unearthed by her. If we went into the Dutch archive looking for traditional music of St. Martin, there wouldn't be any. And the thing is though, that the danger with a lot of that is that when there's a whole section of St. Martin, I think from a lot of my life growing up, you'd hear people talk about the fact that we had no culture. That's a thing that a lot of like young people will say, like, oh, we don't have any culture here. Like, what happened? And because there's no access to it. And so that absence, it leads to a form of erasure, or that erasure makes people think that it wasn't there. And so I think there's been an interesting turnaround because of people like Clara then teaching kids, these songs, passing on something as simple as recipes at a summer camp, like having an old person cook this meal. Like it seems simple, but that kind of vernacular kind of like information is the stuff that holds it together. And so for me, sound is a way to connect and to talk about those sort of absences and add that as a layer, even if it's one that you can't necessarily hear, right? We're technically not supposed to be able to hear the Rossby Whistle. It's a simulation of the Rossby Whistle, right? And so all of those things are why I use sound and like to access it. Even like the sound of the sound and actually the vibrations, right? I think one of the things I really do like is, especially with some of the Rossby Whistle and even the other frequency, ideally when those pieces are in a room, you feel the sound, like that's usually when they're like, how much louder? And it's like, doesn't have to be loud, but when you start to feel, it's like, okay, and that doesn't necessarily have to be really, really loud actually, but you'll sort of sit there and so I'm interested in sound that does that as well. It has that kind of visceral reaction for people.
I completely resonate with Deborah about elders who pass and knowledge and intergenerational knowledge through sound transmission. Is just nothing like that. I enter with smell from various layers. I think my first time thinking about smell as a medium was when I was thinking about other relationships between the Great Ocean and the Americas, and I was starting to think about, well, if these quote great explorers came to this region but called the Americas today, because they were searching for the spice routes to Asia. It's sort of like a way of thinking about the Americas as being, in the way we know it today, being born out of a desire for aroma. And so as I thought about that, I thought about smell as a metaphor for also all that you can't see, like the invisible sound that Deborah is saying that connects us. But that is pervasive, that's persistent, and you can think of it almost in the most beautiful way of aroma, like a fragrance, but you can also think of it as bigotry, like cigarettes, that particles that are stuck in an old couch or something like that. So think about it in that way, but on a very more tactical level, today we're talking about some very difficult histories. I don't take joy in each time I talk about genocidal history, it takes a little piece out of me and I need to recover, even though it's secondary trauma for everyone who has to hear about these things. So I appreciate people who stick with us through the event. And so I really think about smell as a way to engage people in conversations and kind of bring forth other memories that can be thought of as the stories of plants as social lubricants, right? The ways in which we enjoyed great food. But it's also a way to kind of tie in different audiences. And also smell is actually, unless you have anosmia, is I think one of the most democratic forms of art mediums, because everyone has some kind of strong opinion about a smell. Either you like it or you don't like it. And you don't have to have read like an art history book to maybe necessarily have to understand a scent experience. So for me, it's sort of an entryway and many layers of working that I find effective. And so for the project at Apexart, I know it's a group show, so I didn't want to dominate the space. So I did a very faint scent. But sometimes for solo exhibitions, I like to really take over or create pieces that people can also take away experience in their privacy, such as what I'm doing at BMA right now. And also I know that Mae, you were also saying how have we dealt with like the past years in terms of bringing multisensory work into the world. I've been mailing things to people actually, and it's been very fun, sort of sending scents and notes and kind of conjuring words and multisensory experiences in that vein, which is also very different from traditional exhibition making. So I find there are many ways to get creative with their other senses that are underappreciated.
Mae, you're muted. Just unmute. Yeah, thank you.
Somehow there's still just new Zoom profiles and things. Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of, I think you said the scent cards. It's got a different type of intimacy. You can kind of, you can choose the words in a different way. So there's something about, the materiality, the intentionality of that I think is really compelling. And I think especially in the sort of differently connected virtual realm where like I know we're by now mostly exhausted with yet another Zoom call, and yet it allows us to be in these different ways, places, and be together, and to be differently and in some ways more accessible to other audiences. So I think, you know, as much as sometimes it's easy to frame, you know, the Zoom meeting as a limitation, it also is expanding accessibility in different kinds of ways. And one thing on the question of the materiality, and I think Beatrice, you used the phrase of thinking about the objects as a witness, and I really like that. And I was noticing, again, through the presentation, just how, you know, so much of the histories of slave trade and imperialism, it's like what we have is sugar as the main object that we're kind of following the thing for, in terms of understanding the geographies and the political economies of colonialism, or perhaps cotton. But there's something really interesting about thinking with nutmeg and salt and their various uses and properties, and how that allows us to bring different regions into relations. And I think to maybe redress this question of why isn't it Dutch colonialism that comes to the forefront? Like, it's very often like, okay, the French and the British, awful. And somehow the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish kind of get off the hook. Or not off the hook. I wouldn't say that at all. I would say in terms of where most of the scholarship and kind of collective common sense about who the culprits are, it disproportionately falls on some of those bigger islands and bigger spaces. And so I'm interested in thinking about, from a small place, if we're thinking with Jamaica Kincaid, about Roon and about St. Martin, but then about some of these particular spices, objects that have received a little bit less analytical attention. And I think in framing that question, you know, there's always the caveat of from whom, right? Because, you know, the fact that scholars or artists might have paid less attention to these particular objects doesn't mean that they are not very much prominent in the collective storytelling and everyday lives of people who are most directly impacted by this violence and by these so-called trade routes.
I think I do want to just say before I guess respond to that a bit, but the Spanish, you know, so when you read the Dutch history books, like in high school, we learned that it was, you know, Spanish and the Portuguese were essentially the instigators of slavery in the world. You know, and you learn about everybody else, but, you know, mainly the Spanish and the Portuguese. And then you know, when you dig deeper, then my history teacher would talk about the fact that, you know, that Holland was at war with Spain. So of course, Spain is their evil empire, so to speak. And so, yeah, so I think Spanish, a lot of the Spanish speaking countries have like done a lot of that, like research into those spaces. And also like, I think the French, but I think that, you know, one of the things about the region for the Caribbean is language, right? A lot of that research exists in a language that all of us don't have necessarily access to. And that's something in a way that allows you to not talk to each other. And so even thinking about like power structures within then the Caribbean region, politically, you know, English speaking islands have a certain, you know, within CARICOM have a political unity, whereas in, you know, the Spanish then have to align themselves with Latin America because Cuba is considered like a bad guy. So there are all these sort of like other and then thinking about the archive that is housed in Cuba. You talk about like an archive for the region is like, you know, that's housed in Casa de las Americas that we don't have access to because it's on a list of countries that, you know, it's problematic to visit if you know, and so there are those, yeah, so I did want to sort of add that to what you were saying. But I think, you know, also to touching like on what Beatrice mentioned, I think when I first encountered her work was, yeah, thinking about smell, right? Thinking about these things that seem so innocuous. but at the same time mean so much, right? Because like you go into somebody's home and you smell, so smell is a trigger, all right? And so for me, I'm always thinking too with history, like what are the triggers in terms of memory, right? I think what you remember is based on your trigger, all right? And that usually food or those smells will trigger sort of like sort of more pleasant memories. But the idea of this sort of perfume and the smell, and then one's considered like, a yucky smell as opposed to one that's yummy, like, so some people will like some things that are more pungent would mean home to somebody, whereas to somebody else is like, what is this? And how that is tied to kind of like colonial mindset, like, right, how we've been conditioned to believe some things are more pleasant than others. So I too, because we are sort of dealing with this really heavy and dark subject matter. The same thing for me, I think of the land as a witness, right? So I'm using flowers and I'm to like image like floral images and images of the sea and water that seems soothing until you think about sort of the horror that's implicated in there, and it's kind of a seduction that's happening, right? Like I know that for the people who will connect to it differently, like, so a lot of the times I'm also thinking too of communicating to people here who have not read art historical text. And so a lot of the times that's a gauge for me that I especially after going to an MFA program with a lot of conceptual information, like how do I make sure that if I showed this work at home, that there is a conversation that can happen with the people who reside here who have not read Benjamin or read like any, glissons or whatever. But which interestingly enough, they have, but just because he's like, George Lamming passed away a couple days ago, right? And it's been really interesting for me to have it here because so many people, he's come to St. Martin like 2 or 3 times. And so people have like actual stories. So he's not like this like George Lamming to them. He's this like gentleman who came and gave a talk and they were able to have a conversation with, and they got his book and they feel that they know him, and I remember like reading like obituaries and I was thinking like, wow, for so many people, he's this sort of like an archive in and of itself, right? This sort of like unattainable, but in a sort of smaller sense, in a more local sense to people, he's an actual like person who they got like information from that they could relate to and who was able to talk to them in a way that wasn't necessarily like a BBC interview, right? And I appreciated that duality. And I think when we work in this kind of work, we have to have this kind of way of passing on the information in a way that protects us, but also protects the viewers, like the people who will be triggered by seeing this. Like we've seen images of death and destruction and genocide. It's just what you sort of, when you go, you see this, right? And so how do you, protect yourself? Sometimes I think the Rossby Whistle, I let it play a lot of times, and so like it's just like it's a very like I know for some people it's like it's a sound that after a while can I think drive you maybe a little mad. But sometimes I just sit in it when I'm editing and just let it run, and I think there's something about it that I find soothing, or the sound of water. And making sure that there's a balance between that history and then how I'm telling it in a way that's also just respectful and not re-traumatizing, because that happens a lot too. Having those images of pain and always on repeat can become a lot. And I think we encountered that with like in a contemporary sense with someone like George Floyd. I think it's probably the first time people were like seeing a video over and over and over and over again, and to be inundated with something. And so I think about a lot of us who historically have been inundated with images like this, so.
Yeah, I just want to add, when I was thinking about the works that were going to come into 1,000 Secrets, like I was very intentional about bringing together works that are engaging with these really traumatic, very violent histories, but aren't reproducing this spectacle of suffering. It's like we don't see the mangled bodies of the respective areas, time pieces, time periods, but when we get our a collection of different pieces that allow us to ask different questions, give us different points of entry into understanding those very real, material, violent histories, and then also, asking questions across regions, giving different kinds of perspectives. And so I just wanted to acknowledge there are a few comments in the chat. I see some observations about parallels being drawn with Hong Kong and the evolution of those textbooks right now with what's going on, in the sense that they will no longer be written about as being former British colonies. And I see also some continuities with the shape of the fort at the Cape of Good Hope, the dominance of Afrikaans being the combination of Dutch, Malay, Portuguese, and there's a similar, like what you were saying about folks in St. Martin learning Dutch in school, and then after that maybe not coming back to it, but it's still being the administrative language. I think very much in apartheid South Africa, there's this break between, who could do business, who could advocate for themselves in this language of power, and then what are the politics of kind of home languages, if you will, beyond that. And then I see one more question for Deborah about the evolution of your, I guess from the time that you first heard about the Rossby Whistle, how has your use of it adapted in your work? And then I think, so we'll let Deborah answer that, and then I'll give Beatrice a chance to add some final remarks, and then I think we will be at the end. Understand if folks have to leave, we'll probably go 5 minutes or so over. But thank you so much for a very rich conversation, and I hope we can keep going.
So really quick, what's interesting with Afrikaans is that the Dutch, in my Dutch history, but I always learned that apartheid was a function of the British. It wasn't and so it wasn't until I was in my late 20s watching an interview and someone was speaking Afrikaans and I heard it for the first time, and I didn't need to read the subtitle, the captions. And I was just like, wait, that's Dutch, it's old Dutch, it just, so again, what gets taught, right? And until you come across it. In terms of the Rossby Whistle, I think in the very first piece that I used it in was, it was subtle. I sort of broke it up. It was in a piece called The Water Between Us Remembers. So we wear this history on our skin, long for a salt bath and hope the salt will cure what ails us. And so after first encountering it, I wanted to be, I think, circumspect with how I was using it. It was there in the piece and it was audible in some parts and not so much. And that's because the soundtrack for that included singing and sort of more instrumentation. Drawn by Water Act 1 was the first time that I just used it. And it was that piece I was angry at the time, thinking about in the midst of this hurricane while trying to get aid to family and you're playing a weird political game. So I was just I almost liked the concussive aspect of it. It just felt like a roar. And I think that's the interesting thing for the Rossby Whistle. Depending on the piece that I put it with, it can come across as a roar, and sometimes it's more of a heartbeat, and sometimes it feels more subtle, even though it's the same piece. And in the other pieces, then it's sort of interwoven where it's a little less. The middle piece, part 2, is probably the most subtle, whereas, and in the piece that's in the show, it's combined then with bass feedback, which then makes it really, the two of them combined really sort of will amplify each other. And I was thinking at the time then of this man-made sound with this sort of natural occurring sound and what happens when they sort of intersect. And it's just in a quick way to answer that.
I think we can go on and on, but I think just some things that come to mind are just, I think what has been done in the past hour and a half is that it has shown the importance of creative work that we are all collectively doing together, both curators, art administrators, art organizations, artists, and also everyone else who came to engage, that we're trying to retell these stories and reshape public narratives one by one. And it's difficult work to dismantle a lot of these structures that exist that don't allow certain stories to be told, but they find their ways through the cracks. And so I think what we're doing is we're storytelling to re-rolled, right, in the moment, but also thinking more about futurity, because I don't think we're doing all, I mean, there's a point we enter this because it's about, we were trying to understand our own family histories and why are there certain traumas within our communities that we're not able to broach. But then as the path grows, it has become, I think, for many people, thinking about the future generation and what world they're inheriting, and understanding that I can go on and talk about the Dutch, but I was like, it's really about this larger story about what was the foundation, what allowed for European liberalism, right? And we go back to the amazing scholar, Beatrice Lowe, who wrote The Intimacies of Four Continents. You got to think about what are the pillars that allowed all to happen, right? There's overlapping histories of enslavement, dispossession, and migration, and the continuation of unjust labor. And so all of that needs to be reconfigured, but it can't be done in a harsh way in which that it was brought to the world. It needs to be done with care and gentle, loving care that allows us to understand each other in a much more intersectional way. And I think that is the beauty of layered artworks that I get to experience. I'm very lucky to be in conversations with people doing the hard work, not just in the arts, but also in education. I'm meeting high school teachers who want to build decolonial curriculum and work with their students in New Jersey. I'm meeting community culture bearers who, they're holding space for their community members when they're ready to tell stories together, but they have to deal with urgent community matters. It's all across the board, from grassroots to amazing professors who are trying to transform and get tenureship for people who normally don't get tenureship, right? I'm seeing that, and I'm so lucky to see that. So that's kind of my little closing remark. I have one last little story. I've been holding this little object. When I do like events, I have to hold little objects in front of me that tell stories. So I'm going to show you what I have. May, you might know this. It's a piece of broken porcelain. I'm like a YouTuber now. I'm like, oh yeah. It's a piece of broken porcelain that my partner found when we were visiting the Banda Islands. It was just kind of, you're on the beach and just washes up, and there's lots of them. And in the show at Apexart, I was inspired by this piece to make my own sort of broken porcelain. But what is it? I learned that in St. Croix, like the artist Belle Lavant, she also works a lot with these pieces. They're called Chinese locally in the region. And it means China money, supposedly, because the kids find them. And they were basically discarded porcelain from trade ships that would come into the ports, right? And then some of the porcelain is broken. The sailors, the merchants, they would throw them out of the ship because they didn't want to pay taxes, right, for the extra porcelain on their ship. So I just think that these fragments of history survive, right? And they end up in my studio and inspire new works to tell stories. So I probably should have I should have handled this with gloves, but here I am. Sorry, everyone, poor art handling behavior. But I think it's really what we're doing is taking these shards and fragments from another century and trying to make sure there's continuity. And so we each become knowledge and culture bearers in that process. That's my thought for the afternoon, evening. Turn it back to May and Maya.
Yeah. I think that's such a wonderful point to end on. And I know in the previous programming session, we talked a lot about thinking with the Cheney and the pieces of porcelain, and this idea that, sometimes we think of shards of history as kind of a metaphor. But the pieces in the show really remind us that there is a material dimension, that there are like these real physical, tangible stakes that, are also shards of history that can continue to guide us with this quest for reworlding and for reimagining futurity. So I just want to thank you both again for a really incredible afternoon if we're in the same time zone. It's been really, really special to hold this space with you, and I will turn it back over to Maya to give some final announcements from Apexart. And thank you to everyone in the audience for questions, comments, for journeying with us through this conversation.